pregnant. She was abandoned by her ex until a single dad appeared and changed everything. The Carolina sun beat down on the empty stretch of Route 9, and Emily Chandler stood in the gravel with her blue dress clinging to her from the heat, her black flat shoes already dusted with red clay. She was 29 years old, the CEO of a marketing empire worth more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes, and in that moment, she had never felt so small. 6 months pregnant, her hand resting instinctively over the curve of her belly, she watched the silver sedan that had just abandoned her disappear around the bend. "Grant!" she had screamed, but he was already gone, just like that. 10 years together, and he left her on the side of a 2-lane highway outside a town called Millbrook because she told him the truth, that she was done pretending their marriage was something it wasn't. Done pretending his late nights meant nothing. Done pretending she didn't know about the woman in Charlotte. He'd pulled over in a fury, told her to get out and think about what she'd done, and driven off before she could even reach for the door handle again. Now she stood in the heat with nothing but her purse, her phone with no signal, and a baby who kicked against her ribs as if sensing her fear. Emily Chandler built Chandler Creative from nothing. She had grown up in a trailer outside Knoxville, worked 3 jobs through college, and clawed her way into rooms where people like her weren't supposed to sit. She had negotiated with billionaires without blinking. She had fired executives twice her age without raising her voice. But out here, on this empty road, none of that mattered. Out here, she was just a pregnant woman who didn't know which direction led to help. She started walking. The gravel bit through the thin soles of her shoes, and sweat traced lines down her back. 10 minutes. 20. Her vision blurred at the edges from the heat. And for a moment, she thought about sitting down right there in the dirt and letting the world do whatever it wanted with her. That was when she heard the truck. It was an old Ford, rust creeping along the wheel wells, engine grumbling like an old dog that didn't want to get up in the morning. It slowed as it approached. And Emily's first instinct, the instinct of a woman who had spent a decade dodging predatory men in boardrooms, was to brace herself. Her hand tightened around her phone, useless as it was. The truck stopped. The window rolled down, revealing a man with brown hair damp at the temples, wearing a burgundy plaid shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms. His jeans were worn soft at the knees, and when he leaned across the seat to speak to her, she caught the scent of sawdust and coffee. "Ma'am, you all right?" His voice was low, careful, the voice of a man who had learned not to startle things. "It's about 94 degrees out here, and you're, well," he glanced respectfully at her belly. "You shouldn't be walking in this." "I'm fine," Emily said automatically, the CEO reflex kicking in before her body could remind her that she absolutely was not fine. "I didn't ask if you were fine. I asked if you needed a ride." He said it plainly, without an ounce of the smugness she'd have expected from a man in a boardroom saying something clever. This was just a fact he was stating. Like the weather. Emily hesitated. Every warning her assistant, her lawyer, her therapist had ever given her about strangers rose up in her mind. But then, the baby kicked again. Harder this time, and the sun seemed to press down like a hand on the back of her neck. And she thought quite simply, "I might faint if I don't get out of this heat." "Millbrook," she said. "Is there a town near here called Millbrook?" "That's where I'm headed. Got about 15 minutes on you." He reached over and pushed the passenger door open from the inside. An old habit since the outer handle had rusted through the year before. "Name's Daniel. Daniel Reyes." Emily. She didn't offer a last name. Some habits from the world of negotiations never really left her. As she climbed into the cab, wincing slightly at the strain in her lower back, she noticed a small voice from the back seat. "Daddy, who's that?" Emily turned to find a little girl, maybe 6 years old, blonde hair pulled into 2 uneven pigtails, wearing a hot pink dress with a smear of what looked like grape jelly near the hem, and small white shoes that had clearly seen a summer's worth of puddles and dirt. The girl was staring at Emily's belly with wide, curious eyes. "This is Miss Emily, Soph. She's gonna ride with us a ways." Daniel's voice softened entirely when he spoke to his daughter, a warmth Emily hadn't expected from a man who, moments ago, had spoken to her with such flat practicality. "Is there a baby in your tummy?" Sophie asked, leaning forward against her seatbelt. "There is," Emily said, and despite everything, the heat, the humiliation, the fear pooling cold in her stomach, she felt the corner of her mouth lift into something almost like a real smile. "A little girl, actually. Like you." Sophie's whole face lit up. "I knew it. I could tell. Daddy said I couldn't tell. But I could tell." Daniel chuckled, pulling the truck back onto the road, gravel crunching beneath the tires. "She's been saying that about every pregnant lady we've seen since March. She's got about a 50% success rate." Emily let out a small, surprised laugh, the first real laugh she'd allowed herself in weeks. She studied the man beside her out of the corner of her eye. His hands on the wheel were rough, calloused, a working man's hands. There was sawdust caught in the cuff of his shirt. His boots, brown leather, scuffed at the toes, looked like they'd walked 1,000 job sites. He didn't look at her the way Grant's colleagues looked at her, assessing, calculating, wondering what she was worth. He just drove, glancing occasionally in the rearview mirror to check on his daughter, humming faintly along with the radio. "You don't have to tell me what happened back there," Daniel said after a while, eyes on the road. "But if that car left you out here on purpose, you might want to think about whether you want to go back to wherever it's taking you." Emily's chest tightened. How had he known? "I saw the way you were standing when I pulled up," he continued quietly, not unkindly. "Like you were bracing for something. I've seen that look before." She didn't answer. Instead, she looked out the window at the pine trees blurring past, at the little wildflowers growing wild along the ditches, and wondered for the first time in years what it might feel like to actually be safe. They drove in silence for a while, save for Sophie humming a tune from some cartoon in the back seat. As Millbrook's water tower came into view over the tree line, Daniel spoke again. "There's a diner in town, Rosie's, best sweet tea in 3 counties, and Rosie won't ask you a single question you don't want answered." He glanced at her, just briefly. "Might be a good place to sit a spell. Figure some things out." Emily nodded slowly. "Thank you, Daniel." "Don't thank me yet," he said, a faint, tired smile crossing his face. "Wait till you taste the tea." But even as he said it, something in his expression shifted. Just for a second, a flicker of worry crossing his features as he checked the rearview mirror again. Not at Sophie this time. At the road behind them, where a black SUV had appeared, matching their speed exactly, staying 3 car lengths back the entire way into town. Emily didn't notice. She was too busy looking down at her hands, folded over her belly, wondering how her life had brought her to this moment, riding in a stranger's rusted truck toward a town she'd never heard of, carrying a child whose father didn't even know where she was. She had no way of knowing that the black SUV following them belonged to someone who very much did. Emily thought back for just a moment to the morning of that same day. How ordinary it had seemed when she woke up beside Grant. How she had almost talked herself out of confronting him one more time. She had rehearsed the words in the shower, in the car, in the elevator down from their penthouse. She had told herself that this time would be different, that maybe if she simply asked calmly, without accusation, he might finally tell her the truth on his own. Instead, he had turned the radio up louder when she started speaking, as if her voice were nothing more than static to be tuned out. It was that gesture, more than anything he actually said, that had broken something loose inside her. The realization that she had become background noise in her own marriage. She hadn't packed a bag. She hadn't called ahead to a hotel. She had simply opened the car door on a stretch of empty highway and stepped out into the heat, driven by something more primal than planning. The same instinct, perhaps, that had once made her walk into a room of skeptical investors with nothing but a business plan scribbled on diner napkins and a stubborn refusal to be told no. She had built an empire on that stubbornness. Now it had left her stranded on Route 9 with a baby kicking against her ribs and a stranger's kindness the only thing standing between her and the ditch. Daniel didn't ask any of this. He didn't pry. He simply drove, one hand loose on the wheel, the other resting against the window frame, humming faintly along with a country station that crackled in and out of range. There was something almost unbearably gentle about a man who could sense a woman's whole world had just cracked open and choose simply not to make her explain it before she was ready. Rosie's diner sat on the corner of Main and Fifth, its neon sign missing the apostrophe so that it simply read Rosie's in faded pink letters. Inside, the air smelled like bacon grease and fresh coffee, and ceiling fans turned lazily overhead, stirring the humidity without really defeating it. Emily slid into a booth across from Daniel, who had Sophie settled beside him with a coloring placemat and a small cup of crayons the waitress kept behind the counter just for her. "You come here a lot?" Emily asked, taking in the worn red vinyl seats, the chalkboard specials, the row of regulars at the counter who all seemed to know Daniel by name. "Every Tuesday and Thursday, since Sophie's mama passed," Daniel said, his voice even, practiced, the way people speak about grief once they've carried it long enough to know how to hold it without dropping it in front of strangers. "Gives us something regular. Kids need regular things." "I'm sorry," Emily said quietly. "It's been 3 years." He shrugged, though his eyes told a different story. "We manage." Sophie, oblivious to the weight of the conversation above her, held up her coloring page. "Look, Miss Emily, I made the sun purple because regular yellow is boring." "That's the best sun I've ever seen," Emily said. And she meant it, in a way that surprised her. She hadn't spent real, unhurried time with a child in years. Grant hadn't wanted kids until, suddenly, 6 months ago, he did. And she had let herself hope that maybe this pregnancy would fix what was already broken between them. She knew now how foolish that hope had been. The waitress, a broad-shouldered woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, arrived with 3 glasses of sweet tea without being asked. "Daniel Reyes, who's your friend?" "Emily," Daniel said. "Car trouble." It wasn't exactly a lie. Rosie, because of course this was Rosie, studied Emily for a moment with the particular scrutiny of small-town women who could smell a stranger's secrets from across a room, then simply nodded and said, "Well, Emily, you let us know if you need anything. Pie's on the house today. Made too much peach." As Rosie walked away, Emily felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest, the sensation of being looked after by people who wanted absolutely nothing from her. In the world she came from, everyone wanted something. Board members wanted her signature. Investors wanted her time. Grant, she now understood with a clarity that hurt like a physical wound, had wanted her name on his properties, and her money quietly funding a life she wasn't a real part of. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said. Once Sophie had wandered off toward the diner's ancient jukebox with a fistful of quarters Rosie had given her. "That car, the one that left you on the road, was that your husband?" Emily wrapped both hands around her sweat-beaded glass. "Yes. He know you're pregnant. It's his." Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that the question had cost him something to ask. "And he just left you there?" "He does that," Emily said, and the words came out flatter than she intended, worn smooth from years of repetition inside her own head. "Not literally, not usually, but he leaves, emotionally. Financially, he's very present. My money makes sure of that. But everything else, he checks out of. I finally told him I knew about the affair, and he said I'd ruined a perfectly good afternoon, and then he told me to get out and cool off. On a highway, 6 months pregnant. He didn't think I'd actually get out. But you did. I've spent my whole life proving people wrong about what I would and wouldn't do," Emily said. And for the first time since the truck door had closed behind her, her voice cracked. "I built a company from a card table in my grandmother's kitchen. I am not going to sit in a car and let a man scream at me like I'm something he owns." Daniel didn't say anything for a moment. He just watched her, with an expression she couldn't quite name, not pity, which she would have hated, but something closer to respect, mixed with a sadness that seemed to belong to his own life more than hers. My wife left when Sophie was 3, he said finally. Not died, left. I tell people she passed because it's easier. And because in some ways, to Sophie, she has. She calls twice a year, if that. Birthdays sometimes. She's somewhere in Arizona last I heard. Remarried, no kids with the new husband. He turned his coffee cup slowly on its saucer. I used to think I did something wrong. Took me a long time to understand that some people just aren't built to stay. No matter what you do. Emily looked at him. Really looked at him. Past the plaid shirt and the sawdust and the truck that smelled like cedar and old coffee. And saw a man who had rebuilt an entire life out of routine and love and Tuesday-Thursday dinners at a diner that gave his daughter free crayons. How do you do it? She asked. Just raise her, alone, work, all of it. One day at a time mostly, Daniel said. I do carpentry, cabinetry mostly, some furniture restoration on the side. It's not much money, but it's honest, and it lets me be home by 4 most days. Sophie's my whole world. Miss Emily. Everything I do because of her. Sophie chose that exact moment to return to the table, sliding into the booth with the particular drama of a 6-year-old delivering breaking news. Daddy, the man outside is taking pictures of the truck. Both adults turned toward the window. Parked across the street, partially obscured by an oak tree, sat the black SUV from the highway. A man in a dark suit stood beside it, phone raised, angled unmistakably toward Daniel's truck and toward the diner's front window. Emily's stomach dropped. She would recognize that particular stillness anywhere. It was the stance of a man being paid to watch, not to act. Do you know him? Daniel asked quietly, already moving Sophie's crayons back into their cup, already thinking 3 steps ahead the way a father learns to. No, Emily said, though her heart was pounding now, hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. But I think I know who sent him. Grant didn't send strangers to take pictures. He barely noticed when she left the room. There was only one person in Emily's life meticulous enough, controlling enough, to have a man in a suit photographing a rusted pickup truck within 2 hours of her disappearance. And that thought terrified her far more than the highway ever had. Miss Emily, Sophie whispered. Tugging at her sleeve, her small face suddenly serious in the way children's faces become when they sense adult fear without understanding its source. Are you in trouble? Emily looked down at the little girl's wide blue eyes, then up at Daniel, who was already reaching for his wallet to pay the bill. His expression unreadable, steady, the expression of a man deciding in real time whether to get involved in something far bigger than a roadside rescue. I don't know yet, sweetheart, Emily said softly, but I think we're about to find out. For a moment, none of them moved. Rosie's diner carried on behind them. The clatter of dishes. The low murmur of the lunch crowd. The jukebox Sophie had abandoned mid-song. Utterly indifferent to the quiet unraveling happening in one corner booth. Emily found herself studying Daniel's face for the calculation she'd learned to expect from every person who had ever offered her help. The subtle recalibration of interest once someone realized exactly how much money was attached to her name. It never came. His expression stayed the same as it had been on the highway. Steady, unhurried, entirely unimpressed by the idea that she might be someone important. You know? Daniel said quietly, watching the man across the street finally climb back into the SUV. Most folks around here wouldn't know a corporate takeover from a tractor pull. Whoever's coming for you, they're going to expect you to run somewhere loud, a city, a lawyer's office, somewhere with your name already stitched into the walls. He glanced at her, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. They're not going to expect you to disappear into a town where the biggest news last month was Widow Halloran's chickens getting loose on Main Street. You make it sound so simple. It's not simple. But it might be smart. For tonight, at least. He said it carefully, leaving the decision entirely in her hands. No pressure behind the words, only an offer laid out plainly on the table between them, the way he might lay out a set of tools before starting a job. Daniel didn't ask more questions in the diner. He simply paid the check, thanked Rosie, scooped Sophie's crayons into his jacket pocket, and guided both Emily and his daughter out the back entrance, past the kitchen, where a line cook nodded at him without breaking stride on his order of hash browns. "Employee only exit," Daniel explained, as they slipped into the alley behind the diner. "I did some cabinet work for Rosie last spring, perk of the friendship." "You didn't have to do that," Emily said, though relief flooded through her at the sight of the empty alley. No black SUV, no man with a phone. "Maybe not, but that fella wasn't taking pictures for a scrapbook." Daniel unlocked the truck, which he'd moved to a side street earlier while Emily used the restroom, a small act of caution she hadn't even noticed him take. "You want to tell me what's actually going on? Or you want me to drop you at the sheriff's office and let you sort it out with someone official?" Emily hesitated only a moment before climbing into the truck. Something about the steadiness of this man, the plaid shirt, the worn boots, the quiet way he'd protected his daughter and a total stranger in the same breath, made her decide to trust him against every instinct her lawyers had ever drilled into her. "My husband's name is Grant Whitfield," she began. Once they were moving again, Sophie, humming softly in the back seat with a fresh coloring page. "But it isn't Grant who scares me. It's his father, Richard. Richard Whitfield runs Whitfield Capital. You may have heard of it. They're all over the financial news. When Grant and I got married, there was a prenup. A very specific, very ironclad prenup, drafted by Richard's lawyers, that stated if I ever filed for divorce, I would forfeit any claim to marital assets accumulated during the marriage, including certain shares of Chandler Creative that Richard's firm quietly acquired as an early investor, back before I knew any better. So, if you leave him, I lose part of my own company." To my father-in-law. Emily's hands trembled slightly around the hem of her dress. "Richard has been trying to force a merger between Chandler Creative and Whitfield's media holdings for 2 years. I've refused every time. He needs my signature, and he's smart enough to know that Grant alone could never manipulate me into giving it. But a messy, humiliating divorce, followed by financial desperation with a newborn. He'd have leverage," Daniel finished grimly. "He'd have everything." Emily pressed a hand to her belly, where the baby had gone still, as if listening. "That man outside the diner works for Whitfield Capital Security." I recognized his stance. Richard has men like that everywhere. If he knows I walked away from Grant on that highway, if he knows I'm out here without lawyers or witnesses, he'll use it. He'll say I'm unstable, erratic, unfit to run my own company while pregnant, and, God forbid, divorced. Sophie, sensing the tension despite not understanding the words, reached forward and patted Emily's shoulder gently from the back seat. "It's okay, Miss Emily. My daddy fixes things. He fixed our whole porch after the storm." Daniel's mouth twitched, caught between a smile and something more serious. "A porch is a little different than a corporate takeover. Baby girl." "But you can still try," Sophie said, with the absolute unshakable confidence only a 6-year-old could summon. Emily let out a breath that was almost a laugh, almost a sob. "I appreciate the confidence, Sophie. Truly." They drove the rest of the way to Daniel's house in a thoughtful quiet. The kind that settles between people who have just shared something real. The house, when they arrived, was small but well kept, white clapboard siding that Daniel had clearly repainted himself, a porch with 2 rocking chairs, a garden bed along the front walk bursting with tomato plants tied to wooden stakes he'd probably built himself. It looked nothing like the 12,000-square-foot house Emily shared with Grant back in Charlotte, and yet, pulling into the gravel driveway, Emily felt something in her chest unclench for the first time in months. "You're welcome to stay for supper," Daniel said, almost shyly as he cut the engine. "Nothing fancy. Spaghetti's about the extent of my culinary genius. But you shouldn't be alone tonight, not with people watching you like that." Emily should have said no. Every rational, controlled CEO instinct in her told her to call her lawyer, book a hotel under an assumed name, put 3 states between herself and whoever Richard had sent. But she looked at Sophie, already unbuckling herself and racing toward the porch to greet an enormous orange cat sunning itself on the top step. And she looked at Daniel, quietly gathering grocery bags from behind the seat that he must have picked up before finding her on the highway, and something in her simply stopped running. "I'd like that," she said. "Thank you, Daniel." Inside, the house smelled like cedar and fresh laundry. Sophie gave Emily a full tour, narrating each room with total seriousness. "This is where Mr. Biscuit sleeps. This is my drawing wall. Daddy says I can draw here but nowhere else." While Daniel started dinner in a kitchen that was small but immaculate. Herbs growing in mason jars along the windowsill. It was during dinner, the three of them crowded around a table clearly built by Daniel's own hands, Sophie recounting an elaborate story about a squirrel that had, in her telling, personally declared war on their bird feeder, that Emily's phone buzzed. She'd nearly forgotten she still had signal. The message was from an unknown number. Just 4 words, cold and precise in a way that made her blood run to ice. "We know where you are." Emily's fork clattered against her plate. Daniel looked up immediately, his easy dinner table expression sharpening into something alert and protective. "Emily?" She turned the phone screen toward him without a word, her hand no longer quite steady. Daniel read the message once, twice, then set down his own fork very deliberately, the way a man sets down a tool he's about to need for something more serious than the job he started with. "Sophie?" he said gently, not taking his eyes off Emily. "Finish your spaghetti and go wash up for bed, all right, baby? I need to talk to Miss Emily about grown-up things." "Is it about the man outside the diner?" Sophie asked, with the unnerving perceptiveness children sometimes have. "It is," Daniel said, "but don't you worry about it. That's my job now." As Sophie reluctantly padded off toward the bathroom, Mr. Biscuits trotting loyally behind her, Daniel turned back to Emily, his voice low and steady in a way that somehow made the fear in her chest quiet, just slightly. "Whoever sent that message," he said, "they don't know you're here." "Not yet. That message is meant to scare you into running somewhere they can predict. A hotel, an airport, someplace with cameras and paper trails." "How do you know that?" "Because I spent 6 years in the army before Sophie was born," Daniel said simply. And for the first time, Emily understood that the quiet steadiness she'd sensed in him from the very first moment on the highway wasn't just the calm of a small-town carpenter. It ran deeper than that, into places she hadn't even begun to ask about. And because right now the last place anyone's going to think to look for a Chandler creative CEO is in a 500-square-foot house on Miller Road with a carpenter and his 6-year-old. Emily stared at him, this man she'd known for barely 5 hours, and felt something shift inside her chest that she didn't yet have the language for. Something that felt dangerously close to hope, and something that felt even more dangerously close to safety. Outside, unnoticed by either of them, the same black SUV rolled slowly past the end of Miller Road, its headlights briefly illuminating the mailbox before continuing on into the dark. It hadn't found the house yet, but it would. Emily sat very still after Daniel finally spoke again, watching the porch light flicker against the moths gathering near the screen door. She thought about her office back in Charlotte, the glass walls overlooking the skyline, the assistant who managed her calendar down to the minute, the boardroom where she had once silenced a room of skeptical investors with nothing but the sound of her own certainty. None of that felt real anymore. What felt real was the chipped paint on the porch railing, the sound of Sophie humming to herself down the hall as she brushed her teeth, the smell of tomato sauce still lingering in the small kitchen. "You don't owe me anything," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I want you to know that. Whatever happens next, whatever this turns into, you already did more than most people would." Daniel leaned back against the counter, arms crossed, studying her with an expression that was neither pity nor obligation, but something closer to quiet resolve. "I didn't stop on that highway because I thought I owed you something, Emily. I stopped because that's just what you do when you see somebody who needs help. Sophie's watching me every single day, whether I realize it or not. She's learning what kind of man to look for one day by watching what kind of man I choose to be right now." He paused. "So no, you don't owe me anything. But I meant what I said. You're not facing whatever's coming alone tonight." Outside, the crickets had started their steady evening chorus, and somewhere down Miller Road, an engine idled in the dark, waiting. The knock came at 9:15, 3 sharp raps against the screen door that made Emily's whole body go rigid at the kitchen table. Daniel was already moving before the second knock finished, one hand motioning for her to stay seated, the other reaching for the flashlight he kept by the door, not as a weapon exactly, but as something solid to hold. It wasn't Richard's men. It was Grant. He stood on the porch in the same pressed shirt he'd worn that morning. Though it had wilted considerably in the humidity, his car keys still dangling from 2 fingers like he'd driven straight from Charlotte without stopping. His eyes found Emily through the screen door, and for just a moment, something like genuine relief crossed his face before it hardened back into the practiced calm she recognized from 100 boardroom negotiations. Emily, thank God. He glanced past her, taking in the small kitchen, the crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator, Daniel standing a deliberate half-step in front of her. You had me worried sick. I drove around for 2 hours before your assistant told me your phone pinged near Millbrook. You left me on a highway. Grant. Emily's voice came out steadier than she expected, steadier than it had in years, honestly, when speaking to him. 6 months pregnant, in 94-degree heat. I panicked. You blindsided me with accusations, and I needed air, and I was going to circle back. You drove for 40 minutes in the opposite direction. Grant's jaw tightened. His gaze flicked to Daniel again, longer this time, cataloging the plaid shirt, the sawdust still faintly visible on his forearms, the way Sophie's crayons sat scattered across the counter behind him. Emily watched something ugly and dismissive pass behind her husband's eyes, the particular contempt of a man who had never once in his life had to build something with his own hands. Who exactly is this? Grant asked, though his tone made clear he'd already decided the answer didn't matter. Daniel Reyes, Daniel said evenly, not moving from where he stood. I gave your wife a ride when you left her stranded. I don't recall asking for your involvement. Grant's voice sharpened, the boardroom edge slipping fully into place now. You didn't have to. I offered it. That's generally how decency works. Daniel's tone stayed level, almost gentle, but there was something underneath it now, something Emily hadn't heard from him yet. A quiet, immovable steel. Grant turned back to Emily, softening his approach the way she'd watched him do 1,000 times in front of investors who needed convincing rather than commanding. Em, come on, let's go home. We'll talk about everything. Charlotte, the money, all of it, once we're somewhere private. This isn't the place for this conversation. Everything you needed to say, you already said on that highway. Emily stood slowly, one hand braced against the table, the baby shifting inside her as if it too sensed the tension in the room. You told me to think about what I'd done. I have. I've thought about it all day, actually. And what I've decided is that I'm done thinking about what I did wrong in a marriage where you're the one who broke every promise you made me. Your father's already called your office twice today, Grant said. And something in his tone shifted, careful now, almost rehearsed. Wondering why you missed the Whitfield board call. Dad's worried about the optics, Em. A pregnant CEO wandering off the highway, disappearing for hours. It doesn't look stable. You know how these things get twisted. There it was. Emily felt the words land exactly where they were meant to. A threat dressed as concern, precisely the kind of maneuver Richard Whitfield had built an empire on. She glanced at Daniel, who had gone very still, listening with the focused attention of a man cataloging every word for later. Tell your father, Emily said slowly, that I am perfectly stable, and that if he continues implying otherwise to anyone, the board, the press, our attorneys, I will have my legal team remind everyone exactly whose signature is required on the Series C documents he's been chasing for 2 years. Grant's expression flickered, just briefly. Something almost like fear passing behind his eyes, before the mask slid back into place. This isn't a negotiation, Emily. Everything with your family is a negotiation, Grant. I just didn't want to admit that about my own marriage until today. He stood on the porch a moment longer, clearly recalculating. clearly unprepared for a version of Emily that wasn't going to fold under the weight of family pressure and quiet threats. Finally, he stepped back, straightening his shirt with a small, controlled motion. "You'll regret this," he said quietly, not shouting, which somehow made it worse. "When this baby comes and you realize what it actually costs to do this alone, you'll regret every part of tonight." "She's not alone." Sophie's small voice piped up from the hallway, where she'd apparently been listening the entire time, clutching Mr. Biscuits against her chest like a small orange shield. "She's got me and my daddy." Grant looked at the little girl for a long, strange moment, something unreadable passing across his face, something that almost looked like shame, before he turned and walked back to his car without another word. The engine roared to life, headlights sweeping briefly across the porch as he reversed down the gravel drive, and then he was gone. Taillights disappearing the same way they had that afternoon on Route 9. Daniel closed the door slowly, sliding the deadbolt with a soft click that seemed enormously loud in the quiet house. When he turned back to Emily, his expression had softened again, the steel from moments ago folding back into the same steady gentleness she'd come to recognize. "You okay?" "He's never spoken to me like that in front of someone before," Emily said, sinking back into the kitchen chair, her hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go. "Like I was an asset that stopped performing." "You're not an asset," Daniel said quietly. "You're a woman who just stood up to a man twice. In one day, on his own terms, and won both times." Sophie padded fully into the kitchen now, climbing into the chair beside Emily with the easy confidence of a child who had decided, somewhere in the last few hours, that this stranger belonged in her home. "Miss Emily, is that man going to come back?" Emily looked down at the little girl's face. So open, so unafraid in a way that made something ache deep in her chest. "I don't think so, sweetheart. Not tonight." But even as she said it, she caught Daniel's eye across the table and understood, from the careful set of his jaw, that he didn't quite believe it either, because Grant's threat hadn't been the real danger. Richard Whitfield had never once, in 15 years of business, made a threat he didn't follow through on, and Emily knew, with a cold certainty settling low in her stomach, that Grant's visit tonight had been nothing more than the opening move. Later that night, after Sophie had finally drifted off to sleep with Mr. Biscuits tucked beneath her chin, Emily lay awake on the narrow air mattress in the small guest room, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a house that wasn't hers. The settle of old wood, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of Daniel's footsteps as he checked the locks one more time before finally going still down the hall. She thought about the life she'd built, brick by brick, deal by deal, since she was 19 years old with nothing but a stubborn refusal to stay poor. She had always assumed that strength meant never needing anyone. Lying there in a stranger's guest room, her body heavy with a child she hadn't planned and a fear she hadn't fully named. She began to understand, slowly, that perhaps real strength had never been about needing no one at all, but about choosing, carefully, who deserved to be let in. Around midnight, she heard a soft knock at her door. Daniel stood in the hallway, still dressed, a folded quilt in his arms. "Extra blanket," he said quietly. "Gets cold in here past midnight, even in summer. Old house, thin walls." He hesitated, then added, "I also wanted to say, whatever happens with Grant's family, whatever comes next, you and that baby aren't facing it from some stranger's guest room. You're facing it from somewhere safe. I need you to actually believe that, not just hear it." Emily took the quilt, her fingers brushing his for just a moment longer than necessary. "Why does that mean so much coming from you? I've had security teams, board members, people paid to protect me my entire adult life." "Because none of them chose it," Daniel said simply. "I did." Then, with a small, tired smile, he added, "Get some sleep, Emily. Grace period's over tomorrow. Sophie's got a field trip permission slip that needs 6 signatures apparently, and I have exactly 0 idea how a kindergarten produces that much paperwork." Despite everything, despite the fear still coiled tight in her chest, Emily found herself laughing softly into the dark long after he'd gone, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in longer than she could remember. 3 days passed in a strange, fragile peace. Emily stayed in the small guest room at the end of Daniel's hallway, a space that had clearly once been intended as a home office. Hastily converted with a borrowed air mattress and a lamp, Sophie insisted on decorating with stickers, so Miss Emily doesn't get scared at night. Emily worked from her phone during the day, quietly moving funds, contacting her attorney, a sharp, discreet woman named Patricia Nguyen, who had represented Chandler Creative since its earliest days, and who listened to Emily's account of the prenup. The highway and Richard's implied threat with a long, grim silence. "Emily," Patricia said finally, over a crackling phone connection, "I need you to understand something. Richard Whitfield doesn't chase mergers through lawsuits. He chases them through narrative. If he can paint you as unstable, an unfit mother, an erratic executive, he doesn't need your signature. He can get a judge to appoint a conservator over your shares in the best interest of the company, and guess who he'll nominate for that role?" The words settled over Emily like ice water. "He'd use my own child against me. He'd use anything against you." "That's what men like Richard do." A pause. "Where exactly are you staying right now?" Emily hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen, where she could hear Daniel helping Sophie with her reading homework, his voice low and patient as the little girl sounded out each word with fierce concentration. "Somewhere safe. Somewhere he doesn't know about yet." "Keep it that way," Patricia said. "And Emily, start documenting everything. Every threat, every implication, every moment Grant or Richard tries to paint you as unfit. If this goes to a courtroom, and I suspect it will, the story you tell first is the story that sticks." That evening, after Sophie had fallen asleep with Mr. Biscuits curled against her side and her reading book still open on the pillow, Daniel found Emily sitting on the back porch steps, staring out at the fireflies gathering above the tomato garden. "Patricia thinks Richard's going to try for a conservatorship," she said quietly. Before he could ask, "Painting me as unstable so he doesn't need a merger. He just needs a judge who believes I can't be trusted to run my own company or raise my own child." Daniel sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "That's a hell of a plan for a man who's never even met you in person. From what you've said, he doesn't need to meet me. He's read every psychological profile his firm's ever commissioned on high-risk executive marriages. He probably has a folder on me thicker than my company's IPO filing." Emily wrapped her arms around her knees, as much as her belly would allow. "I keep thinking about what you said in the truck, about how some people just aren't built to stay. I used to think that was only true of the people who leave. I never thought about the people who stay just to control you." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching the fireflies drift between the tomato stakes. "Can I tell you something I haven't told many people?" Emily nodded. "When I was in the Army, before Sophie, before any of this, I did 2 tours doing logistics security work. Convoy protection mostly, some investigative work alongside military police. I learned to read people who were used to hiding things behind good manners." He paused. "The man outside the diner, the one taking pictures? I got a good look at his jacket when he climbed back in that SUV. Private security firm out of Charlotte. Corporate protection detail, not law enforcement, not federal. Which means whatever Richard's planning, he's not ready to go public with it yet. He's still building his case quietly. How do you know all that from one jacket? Because it's the same firm my old commanding officer runs private contracts through now." Daniel's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. Small world, especially when you spend 6 years learning to notice things other people walk right past. Emily stared at him, something shifting again in her chest. Not just gratitude this time, but something warmer, more dangerous, unfurling slowly beneath years of careful, guarded distance. "You've known this whole time, and you didn't say anything." "I didn't want to scare you before I was sure." He turned to look at her fully now, the porch light catching the tired lines around his eyes. lines that spoke of years spent quietly carrying more weight than anyone around him realized. But I called my old CO this afternoon, while you were on the phone with your lawyer. He's going to see what he can find out about what Richard's actually paying that firm to do. Daniel, Emily's voice caught. You didn't have to get involved in this, any of it. I told you already. His voice was quiet, steady, the same voice he'd used on the highway 3 days ago, the same voice that had made a terrified, exhausted woman climb into a stranger's truck against every instinct she had. I don't help people because I have to. I help them because it's who I am. He hesitated, something vulnerable crossing his face for the first time since she'd met him. And because somewhere between that highway and tonight, I stopped thinking of you as someone I was just helping. The words hung between them in the warm night air. Fireflies blinking lazily around the porch steps. Emily felt her heart do something complicated and terrifying. The same heart that had spent a decade building walls thick enough to survive boardrooms, betrayals, and a husband who'd made her feel invisible in her own marriage. Before she could find the words to answer him, her phone buzzed on the step beside her. Patricia's name lit up the screen, along with a single line of preview text visible before Emily even unlocked it. Emily, call me immediately. I just received official notice. Richard has filed. Emily's blood ran cold. She looked up at Daniel, whose expression had already shifted into that same alert stillness she'd seen the moment Sophie announced the man outside the diner. Whatever peace they'd found in the last 3 days, whatever fragile, unexpected thing had been growing quietly between them on this porch, it was about to collide, head-on, with a fight neither of them could have fully prepared for. He didn't wait, Emily whispered, staring at the screen. He already filed for emergency guardianship over the baby. Tonight. Daniel took the phone gently from her trembling hands, reading the message twice before setting it down on the porch step between them. Then we don't wait either, he said, his voice steady in a way that anchored something in her chest that had been spinning loose since the words emergency guardianship first registered. Call Patricia back. Tell her whatever documentation she needs from tonight, from the porch, from anything Grant said. She has it before sunrise. Daniel, if this goes to court, everything comes out. Where I've been staying. You, Sophie. Richard's attorneys will paint this however serves him best. And it won't be kind to either of us. Let them paint it, Daniel said. And there was no hesitation in it at all, no flicker of the fear she half expected from a man who had built a quiet, careful life specifically to avoid this kind of exposure. I've spent 3 years making sure nothing in Sophie's world ever felt uncertain again after her mother left. I'm not about to start being afraid of a courtroom now, not when it's the difference between you keeping what you built and a man who's never worked an honest day in his life taking it out from under you. Emily called Patricia, her voice steadier than she felt, laying out everything. Grant's visit. The recorded confrontation still saved on her phone. Daniel's information about the private security firm. Patricia listened without interrupting, the sound of rapid typing audible in the background. This is good, Emily. This is very good, actually, Patricia said finally. Richard moved fast. Which means he's nervous, which means somewhere in his finances, there's something he doesn't want examined too closely. Emergency guardianship filings this aggressive usually aren't about protecting a child. They're about controlling an asset before someone else gets a good look at the books. A pause. Get some sleep if you can. Tomorrow's going to be long. And Emily, don't underestimate how much a judge is going to care about the difference between a woman running towards safety and a man running his own daughter-in-law's finances into a court filing. When the call ended, Emily sat in silence for a long moment, watching the fireflies drift lower now, settling into the grass like scattered dying stars. Daniel didn't say anything else. He simply moved closer on the step, close enough that his shoulder pressed warm and solid against hers, and stayed there until the porch light finally flickered off on its timer, leaving them both in the soft, uncertain dark. The courtroom in Charlotte was smaller than Emily expected, all warm wood paneling and fluorescent light that did nothing to soften the coldness radiating from Richard Whitfield, seated beside Grant at the opposing table, his silver hair immaculate, his expression the practiced neutrality of a man who had never once lost a negotiation he'd bothered to prepare for. Emily sat beside Patricia, her hand resting protectively over her belly. 7 months now. The baby's due date circled in red on a calendar back at Daniel's house, a house that had, in the space of 6 weeks, become something she hadn't let herself call home out loud yet, though the word sat quietly in her chest every single day. Daniel sat directly behind her in the gallery, Sophie beside him in her good church dress, swinging her legs against the wooden bench, utterly unaware of how much rested on the next hour. "Your Honor," Richard's attorney began, smooth and unhurried, "the petitioner's concern is simple. Mrs. Whitfield abandoned her marital home, disappeared for 72 hours without contacting family, and has since been residing with an unrelated single man in what can only be described as an unstable, impulsive arrangement, all while pregnant and under significant emotional distress. We're asking the court to appoint a neutral conservator over the child's financial interests until Mrs. Whitfield demonstrates. Objection to characterization, Patricia said crisply, rising with the calm precision of a woman who had spent 15 years dismantling exactly this kind of argument. Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit A. What followed was, in Emily's memory afterward, less a single dramatic reveal than a careful unraveling, thread by thread. Exactly the way Patricia had promised. First, the phone records showing Grant's own admission, recorded legally on Emily's phone during his visit to Daniel's porch, his voice unmistakable. "You'll regret this when you realize what it costs to do this alone." Then the financial documents Patricia's investigators had traced through 6 shell accounts, revealing that Richard Whitfield had, for the past 18 months, been quietly leveraging Whitfield Capital's failing media division against loans secured by Chandler Creative stock he didn't legally control. Stock that would only become accessible to him through exactly the kind of guardianship arrangement he was petitioning for that day. "This isn't a concern for a child's welfare, Your Honor," Patricia said, her voice ringing clear through the small courtroom. "This is a liquidity crisis dressed up as a custody filing. Mr. Whitfield needs access to shares he cannot legally touch, and a conservatorship over an unborn child is the only mechanism his attorneys could construct to reach them." The color drained slowly from Richard's face as Patricia laid each document before the judge. And for the first time since Emily had known him, first through Grant's stories, then through years of stiff holiday dinners, she watched the man's careful composure crack entirely. But it was Grant who broke first. "I didn't know," he said suddenly, standing so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor, his voice raw in a way Emily hadn't heard from him in years. "Your Honor, I swear I didn't fully understand what my father was doing with the accounts. He told me it was a bridge loan, temporary, nothing that would actually touch Emily's company." He turned, finally, to look at her. Really look at her. The way he hadn't in longer than either of them could probably admit. I didn't want this. Not like this." The judge called a brief recess. In the marble hallway outside, Emily found herself facing Grant alone for the first time since the highway, both of them shaken by different pieces of the same collapsing structure. "I loved you once," Grant said quietly. "I think some part of me still does. But I let my father convince me that loving you meant controlling the parts of you that scared him. Your independence, your company, all of it. I'm sorry, Emily. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I just needed you to hear it." Emily studied his face. Tired. Stripped of the performance he'd worn like armor for a decade, and felt something inside her finally, quietly, let go. "I hope you find whatever it is you actually want, Grant. Away from your father's shadow. But it's not going to be with me." When the judge returned, the ruling came swiftly. The guardianship petition dismissed with prejudice. A formal referral made to the state's Financial Crimes Division regarding Whitfield Capital's handling of the shell accounts, and a pointed, unmistakable warning to Richard Whitfield's attorneys about the consequences of filing bad faith emergency petitions in family court. outside on the courthouse steps. Autumn sunlight breaking gold through the trees lining the square. Sophie ran straight into Emily's arms, careful, as she'd been taught, of the belly between them, while Daniel hung back a step, watching with an expression of quiet, overwhelming relief. "You did it," Sophie announced triumphantly. "I told you my daddy fixes things." "He did," Emily said, laughing through unexpected tears. "But I think we did it together, actually." 6 weeks later, in a hospital room 3 towns over from Millbrook, Emily held her daughter for the first time, a small, furious, red-faced girl she named Grace, for reasons she couldn't fully explain, except that the word had been sitting in her chest since the night on Daniel's porch, when a good man had chosen, without hesitation, to stand between her and everything trying to break her. Daniel sat beside the hospital bed with Sophie curled sleepily against his side. The 6-year-old having declared herself, with total seriousness, the world's best big sister the moment she laid eyes on baby Grace through the nursery window. Chandler Creative remained entirely Emily's own, Richard's shell accounts unraveling into a federal investigation that would occupy Whitfield Capital's lawyers for the next several years, far from Emily's carefully protected shares. She sold the Charlotte penthouse within the month and bought a modest house 2 streets over from Daniel's, close enough for Sophie to ride her bike between the 2 homes, though it wasn't more than a handful of months before the distinction between the 2 houses stopped mattering much at all. On a warm evening the following spring, sitting on Daniel's porch with Grace asleep against her shoulder, and Sophie chasing fireflies across the lawn with Mr. Biscuits watching lazily from the steps, Emily finally understood something she hadn't let herself believe on that scorching highway almost a year earlier, that the family she'd been searching for her entire life, through boardrooms and marriages and inherited expectations, had been waiting for her all along in an old rusted truck that had simply, quietly, refused to drive past a stranger in need. Patricia visited that spring too, ostensibly to review the final paperwork closing out the last threads of the federal investigation into Whitfield Capital, though she stayed for dinner far longer than any billable hour could explain, watching Sophie teach baby Grace's stuffed rabbit how to properly hold a crayon with the grave seriousness only a 7-year-old could summon. Before she left, Patricia pulled Emily aside on the porch, the same porch where so much of the last year had unfolded. "You know," Patricia said, glancing back through the window at Daniel, who was laughing at something Sophie had said while carefully burping Grace against his shoulder, "in 15 years of family law, I don't think I've ever seen a client walk into a courtroom that broken and walk out that whole. Most people, when their whole world gets threatened like that, they close up, get harder. You didn't." "I almost did," Emily admitted. "On that highway, I think I was about 30 seconds from deciding I'd never trust anyone again as long as I lived." "What changed?" Emily looked through the window too, at the small, warm chaos of the kitchen, crayons and burp cloths, and a rusted truck key hanging on a hook by the door that Daniel still refused to replace with anything newer, no matter how many times Emily teased him about it. "Someone stopped," she said simply. "That's all it took, really. Someone who didn't want anything from me finally just stopped." That November, on a crisp Saturday morning with the maple trees along Miller Road blazing gold and red, Daniel knelt on the same porch steps where he'd once brought her an extra quilt at midnight, Grace babbling happily in Emily's arms, and Sophie standing beside him practically vibrating with the effort of keeping a secret she'd clearly known about for weeks. He didn't have a speech prepared, he told her later, laughing. Just a small ring he'd designed himself, hammered by hand in the same workshop where he built cabinets and rocking chairs and, once, an entire crib for a baby who wasn't even his own blood yet, but who he'd loved unconditionally since the night he first held her. "I'm not a rich man, Emily," he said, and there was no trace of apology in it, only quiet certainty. "I probably never will be, not the way you're used to, but I will stop on every highway, every single time, for the rest of my life, if it means you and these girls never have to stand alone in the heat again." Emily said yes, before he even finished the sentence. Laughing and crying at once, while Sophie whooped loudly enough to send a flock of starlings scattering from the oak tree overhead, and somewhere in her arms baby Grace startled awake, blinked twice at the commotion, and, as if she understood exactly what she was witnessing, let out a small, delighted laugh of her own. They were married the following June, in the backyard beneath the same maple trees, Rosie catering the whole affair herself and refusing payment, insisting the peach pie was a wedding gift. Least I could do for the two people who finally figured out this town's got more to offer than a diner and gossip. Chandler Creative thrived under Emily's continued leadership. Its foundation now permanently secured against any Whitfield family maneuvering, while Daniel's small furniture workshop slowly expanded into a modest storefront on Main Street. Not because he needed the money, Emily always said with a smile, but because half of Millbrook had started requesting custom pieces the moment word got around about the man who'd built a crib. A porch swing, and eventually a whole new life out of nothing but sawdust, patience, and one simple, unshakable belief: that kindness, offered without condition on a lonely stretch of highway, was never really a small thing at all. Some rides, it turned out, changed everything.